Greetings, Resident Evil fanatics. It's getting dark out here. I hope you don't mind this certain someone walking beside us. It appears they have something for us today. Onwards then, into the castle. And what do we have here? Yes, another hidden tale in survival horror history, the prequel story to Resident Evil 4. Just like the True Story Behind Biohazard serves as a prequel to RE1, as explored through two previous analyses, Biohazard 4 Incubate essentially adds to RE4 in the same way. In a vast sea of supplemental books, files, and lore that build onto the games, it's a shame that Resident Evil 4, being one of the most seminal and critically acclaimed entries of the entire franchise, was not adapted into a novelization like the previous 5 games. This left so much to be desired, considering how S.D. Perry's novels introduced a much more distinct, palpable aura to the characters, while also adding immensely to the obscured scenes of the games. Even the original novels abide by the Resident Evil formula and uniquely contribute to the Resident Evil identity. While none of these novels are technically canon, they remain perhaps the most immaculately detailed versions of the original RE storylines, but unfortunately, RE4 didn't quite make it into this medium. However, we do have this prequel book to enrich our knowledge of Los Illuminados. Biohazard 4 Incubate is accompanied by a film DVD that simply covers the events of RE4's main campaign. But only the book contains exclusive lore, vital nuggets of interest in relation to RE4's world building. It depicts the earlier, more tranquil days of the village, before it was corrupted beyond all hope of return. From serenity to chaos, this book describes how Sadler cemented himself as the villagers' savior, earning himself their veneration. Lots to discuss tonight. I can only hope that our guest doesn't get too excited. Let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get scary. Let's talk about environments in Resident Evil. It's no coincidence that most Resident Evil stories are set in a secluded location, hidden from the public eye. Even if an RE story begins in a more familiar, everyday location, it always snakes its way into one or more labyrinth-like structures and finishes off with an obscured laboratory, often underground. Small villages, grandiose mansions, and secluded islands are all deliberately designed to evoke a sense of dissociation, a bothersome detachment from the real world as we know it. This is a recurring theme that permeates the horror genre as a whole, and for good reason. The horror in a small town trope is a tried and true example of this, as seen in films like It, Frailty,
Nobody wants to press any charges.
I love small towns.
and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
It's an old 2-story rock house and it's sitting up on a hill. I think you have to turn on that road back there, but I'm not real sure.
Yeah, maybe I seen something like that up that way.
When executed correctly, these enigmatic locations deprive us of familiarity, and the threat of the unknown is massively elevated. And these locations are nothing short of intrinsic to the Resident Evil formula. A pretentious mansion has no business being in the woods. No police station should be this size and designed to this absurd degree of complexity, even if it was formerly an art museum. And here we have a meticulously designed prison with the traditional Iron Maiden torture device. God knows what's happened here. Like those of the aforementioned horror films, these bizarre locations fracture our sense of stability. They laugh at the conventional workings of the world and thrive as a warped distortion of that world instead.
There are moments when we cannot believe that what is happening is really true. Pinch yourself and you may find out that it is.
These places fuel the crippling intimidation factor that defines the best Resident Evil titles. They also complement the self-destruct and cliché getaway that ends each entry. The isolated locations combined with the destruction of said locations yields a formula that can spawn sequels to no end, as each environment is virtually non-existent outside of its own entry, and each new entry is defined by its new environment, which again typically ends with a laboratory. This perpetual cycle of investigating a new environment and destroying said environment adds to the cinematic cheesiness and predictability of Resident Evil.
It'll probably seem very silly, but it's like theater.
But on the flip side, each unique environment warrants a distinct type of fear in each entry, and the fact that these structures inevitably blow up or burn down only amplifies their eerie presence for the time that they remain standing. Whether it be a lavish mansion, a trading facility, an entire island, or an isolated village, each of these otherworldly settings convey a unique sense of loneliness, intimidation, and intense alienation in the protagonists. And alienation in particular is the defining forte of RE4's horror. Resident Evil 4's richly inspired village and castle are simply a larger, grander imagining of the aforementioned horror in an isolated town trope, and, fittingly, a natural progression of the isolation induced by its predecessors. While so much of RE4's popular discourse revolves around its gameplay innovations and chaotic development history, tonight's analysis will expose one of its most elusive and underexplored discussion pieces, which is this. Resident Evil 4 is the first and only entry in the series to successfully implement folk horror, a subgenre defined by intense cultural alienation. Rather than relying on physical horror, folk horror induces an eerie sense of detachment and derailment from the world that we know, merely through human behavior. Most genre-defining folk horror films take place in Europe, often depicting various sects of pagan tradition in small communes. These films typically explore the nature-centric worship of these communities, and some even showcase the pagan sabbats, or yearly festivals, as seen in films like The Wicker Man and Midsommar. Keep this in mind, as some of these traditional Wiccan festivals run parallelly with those of RE4's prequel book. Yes, this book undeniably alludes to a number of real Wiccan practices, as we'll explore later on. This serene, rural landscape serves as the ideal atmosphere for folk horror, which again mirrors the farmland and livestock of RE4's village. Then we have our protagonist, who is typically an American tourist or in some way relatable to the mainstream audience. He then travels to this foreign or otherwise alien society.
I was wondering if you might recognize a girl in this photograph?
We empathize with his total lack of familiarity when faced by the behaviors, religious practices, and cultural values that comprise the esoteric society before him. It's crucial to note that at first, the apprehensive emotions arise not from a sense of overt or imminent danger, but a more ambiguous type of fear through cultural and societal alienation. Those subtle premonitions then gradually escalate into violence, often by enforcing sacrificial rites on the hero, or otherwise manipulating him to do wrong, then brutally punishing him for it. The cult-like behaviors and unconventional norms are especially demonized in this genre, effectively dialing up the concept of culture shock to a nightmarish degree. Resident Evil 4, though, full of bloody tense action and hostile enemies, throws us right into the fray, disorienting us with violent locals, alienating us with the barrier of foreign language, and subjecting us to sinister rituals all at once. And now, having framed this prequel book through the lens of folk horror, let us proceed to analyze Resident Evil 4 Incubate. Much like the prequel story of George Trevor and Resident Evil, the book, this book begins with a preliminary statement that reads, "Evil thoughts fall like drops into a clear stream. They silently form ripples on the water, and before long, the stream will be stained as if by mud. The pure heart is led astray, manipulated and fettered in chains, as if by a curse. There is a village, guided by evil teachings, a village of sadness. No flowers by the road, no joyful voices, no trace of the warmth of life anywhere to be found. The only clue to who the villagers that used to live here were lay in sketches and poorly written memos scattered about." The prequel book then begins by describing the peaceful days of the village. The sketches and poorly written memos were written by a villager named Rodrigo. Here is his first passage. "In this village, the people cherish their elders, their neighbors, and their children's smiling faces. It's a simple and joyous life, where people work hard to keep up old customs and traditions. A peaceful life. During this gentle period of time, I was born and returned to the soil. I love this village. I wish it could have continued like that forever. Sometimes I would stop by to borrow the village's writing brush and write down things about this wonderful village to pass on to the yet unborn children of coming generations. Pretty standard stuff here. This illustrates the villagers' common desire to preserve the traditions that define their purpose in life. It's quite fitting for village elders and scribes to document the history of their commune and enforce their worldview on impressionable young children. This recurring practice is best exemplified by the classroom scene in The Wicker Man, as well as the elder or scribe character in Midsommar. On to the next two passages, which read, "Both men and women worked hard in the village. When the sowing season arrived, the entire village was busy with the preparations. In the refreshing morning sun, the bell would ring, and people would head for the farms. Beads of sweat glimmered in the sun on the foreheads of the men cultivating the soil. The women would sing and talk to each other, but they were also busy helping with the sowing. At noon, everyone would sit down and relax, and eat their lunches that had been packed for them. The newly baked bread prepared by the men's wives would help them recover from their fatigue. And then, it was back to work. To the villagers, working the fields was like raising children. With the love of the villagers and nature's blessing, there would be a good harvest before long. It was the same for me. Even the kids would start helping out with tending the cows and chickens at a very young age. Since they were just kids, it was hard work transporting the buckets full of milk that the men had milked from the cows. The blood ties in the village were strong. You might say that the village was like one big family. It was a strong bond that led everyone in the village to help one another out. Every boy in the village knew that when they grew up, they would help the village prosper to the best of their ability. My father was a man of few words, but he had a firm grip on the udders of the cows, and he let me taste the milk from his finger. It had a faint sweetness and a very rich flavor. It was delicious. In just a few hours, we would get to drink this milk at home. These two passages are our first big hints of the book's inspirations from pagan religion and values, and considering that RE4 is set in an undefined region of Spain, Celtic paganism would make the most sense. While this prequel book is more generic and loose in its depictions of pagan practices, it is clearly influenced by the same fundamental principles. This is strongly evidenced through the recurring emphasis of nature's blessing for the cultivation of crops. Hence, all this rigorous farm work is presumably aimed at pleasing the deities of fertility in the hopes of producing a bountiful harvest, which is a focal point of traditional pagan values. All this talk of blessing the crops, protecting the livestock, and love amongst the villagers is definitely building towards something, as we'll see. Out of the 8 annual Wiccan sabbats, one of them is indubitably present here, which we'll analyze in later passages. The next passage reads, "In the afternoon of our day off, one of my friends invited us over for dinner. He was working on excavating the old castle nearby. Since he was happy to be able to do his part in such an important job, he told us about it and boasted a bit. They had many delicious dishes lined up. But for me, the biggest feast was sitting down together, like a family. In this house as well, they valued the furniture and tableware of old times, and took good care of it. They led a simple life, much like our family, but the orderly fashion in which they had lined up everything was very nice. In the garden outside, they had a small flower bed. They lined up in front of it, and I grabbed my brush. As thanks for the dinner, I painted a portrait which they could hand over to their baby when he grew up. They all smiled, shyly. Thank you for your cute, smiling faces." Here is the first mention of the Los Illuminados castle being excavated by Rodrigo's friend. Other than that, this is a pretty generic file that continues to establish the warmth and hospitality shared among the villagers. The next passage is much more significant. In this village, there is a tale that has been passed down through generations. It is a tale of praise of the first lord of the castle who fought paganism in this place. Thanks to that lord, this village exists, and we can continue to live in peace. Usually, it is a tale told by grandparents to their grandchildren, while the child's mom and dad are out working. In the house next door, the grandmother told it to her granddaughter while sewing. And one day, that granddaughter shall most likely be a grandmother herself, and she will tell the tale to her grandchildren in the same fashion. The original lord of the castle was a man with a strong sense of justice who protected the villagers. But the current lord, Sir Ramon. Interesting. So, according to this tale, the first Castellan quelled the pagan uprising that once threatened the village. But it seems that now, Ramon Salazar has withdrawn his protection for the people, perhaps allowing these pagan groups to reawaken. Just as a quick aside, it's pretty funny that the word paganism is directed at a potentially malevolent group that was driven out of the village, when the current villagers are pagans themselves, as they adhere to esoteric practices that deviate from Christianity and other larger faiths, as we've established and will continue to explore. But in an effort to differentiate between the innocent villagers and the malicious outsiders, it's understandable why they use this term. Anyway, more on Salazar's significance later on. Believe it or not, the next two passages actually incorporate the Wiccan sabbat that I mentioned earlier. Here's where it gets itchy and tasty. The time of the harvest has finally come. There looks to be a big harvest surplus this year, which we can sell at a good price in the neighboring town. For that money, we'll be able to buy things that aren't available at the village, such as gasoline. The villagers all worked together to load the truck with the surplus crops, and even though it was hard work, the children also helped out. The driver stepped on the gas pedal, and the truck rolled off. Children are to be treasured. That is what everyone in the village has been brought up to know. Everyone wishes for nothing but the children to grow up to be strong and healthy. When all the work was done, it was already sunset. Tomorrow is the harvest festival. I should go to sleep early today and wake up early tomorrow. Today is the harvest celebration, a ceremony to thank nature for a good harvest. Eat well, as much as you like, dance in a circle, and after all the fun, you lie down and watch the starry sky. And even though it's late at night, the children are allowed to stay up and play for as long as they can muster. Since this is one of the few special festive days for the village, the parents are willing to let the kids stay up just for tonight. And since they've all been working so hard, they enjoy this special day together. Some people read the stories they've written out loud. Families join together and sing in chorus, and some people tell that special someone how they feel about them. And finally, the man with the guitar plays his song and sings his thanks for the good harvest. As he sings, even the most shy people of the village join in, and smile as the village is joined in happiness. For some reason, the village chief did not show up this year. But Lord Mendez is probably in the church with the priest, working hard and couldn't make it, I suppose. Here it is. These two passages heavily allude to one of the 8 pagan sabbats, and that sabbat is none other than Beltane, also known as May Day. This festival embodies fertility and uninhibited lust, celebrating the first day of summer, on which the Earth's vital energies are at their zenith. These motifs are colorfully reflected through the festival's joyous practices, which are alluded to right here in this prequel book. For starters, a ceremony to thank nature for a good harvest encapsulates exactly what Beltane is all about. This festival emphasizes the impregnation of the Great Mother by the Great Father, who are most commonly embodied by the female Mother Earth and a male god with solar attributes, respectively. That male god in the Celtic practice is typically the fire god, Bel, from whom the name Beltane was derived. The revitalizing fire of summer symbolizes the male fire god fertilizing the female earth, and thus cultivating the crops on the first day of summer and ensuring an abundant harvest.
To Nuada, our most sacred god of the sun, and to Avalanau, the beloved goddess of our orchards, in order that we may furnish them with renewed power to quicken the growth of our crops.
To celebrate this divine cultivation, the villagers gleefully dance in a circle, as described here. This circular dance is done under a maypole, which represents the aforementioned unity of male and female pagan deities. The phallic pole and the triangular wrapping of ribbons represent the male and female genitalia, respectively, binding lovingly with one another. The people gather underneath this maypole and dance to their heart's content. And after a day of dancing, singing, and largely oat-based foods, the people stay awake overnight, eagerly awaiting the May sunrise. The divine rays of light and fire on the first day of summer is indeed a sight to stay up for. This is another practice that distinguishes Beltane from any other sabbat. Very fitting to see it mentioned here. Later in the passage, we learn that some people tell that special someone how they feel about them, which is yet another core practice that discerns this festival as Beltane. To further celebrate the regenerative influences of the earth, the people will share their love and lustful desires with their desired partners on this day, hence the aforementioned theme of unashamed sexuality. In some Celtic accounts, couples will make love and frolic in the fields to mimic the sexual bonding of the male and female deities, further nourishing the crops through their own unity. In many cultures, the arrival of spring and/or summer is an auspicious time for mating, sex, and impregnation, such as Dragobete, the Romanian festival of love and bonding. Beltane is quite similar, and just to add to all the parallels we've established, here's one more unwritten connection. RE4's village has a large bonfire at its center. Beltane and the fire god Bel are materialized through this flame as the generative source of vitality among the villagers. The candles are extinguished in the people's homes and then reignited in the central bonfire to signify the revitalization of the earth's energies on the first day of summer. The people typically gather around the fire, singing and dancing, and sometimes even leap over the fire to receive its blessings more overtly. The fire also provides nourishment and protection to the livestock and children, shielding them from pestilence and predatory animals like foxes and wolves. It just seems so appropriate in the context of RE4's early days. The fire would emanate embers of love, inspiring growth and aspirations in the children. This is a recurring theme throughout the prequel book. And if, God forbid, some calamity were to befall these beloved children, the village's spirit would be shattered. As these two passages describe, some sects of paganism celebrate Beltane as May Day Eve and May Day, except that if this were the case, it'd make more sense to stay awake on May Day Eve rather than on May Day itself. It's also crucial to note that Rodrigo describes this festival itself as a harvest, when really, Beltane is much better described by the line, a ceremony to thank nature in advance for a good harvest. Rather than being the harvest festival itself, Beltane celebrates the summer's light and fire fertilizing the earth in order to reap a harvest later in the year during the 3 real harvest festivals, known as Lughnasadh, Autumn Equinox, and Samhain. But again, this book is more loose in its references, and the writers probably found it more simple to call it a harvest festival itself, despite its practices of circular dancing, staying awake overnight, and sexual partnering all clearly alluding to Beltane. And that's Beltane, or May Day, explained in the context of this prequel novel. All of these parallels certainly transform our perception of the villagers' values and behaviors, offering a more meaningful backing to the implied Celtic pagan tradition. The folk horror elements of RE4 feel much more meaningful through this pagan lens of interpretation. The village's history is, to a substantial degree, grounded in real Celtic paganism. Now, let us proceed further. Around here, lots of people work together to cook. Everyone does their fair share. We use crops that grow around the village, milk from the cows, eggs from the chickens, fish from the river, ingredients that we collectively brought from town, and then everyone takes their share back home. My brother, who lived nearby, had loaded his wagon with his goods, and the two of us walked off with the sun shining on us through the leaves. We heard birds sing, looked at flowers by the roadside, and had fun talking to each other all the way to his home. My brother's family came outside to meet up with him, and as he waved at them, both he and his horse picked up the pace as they headed for the house. He tied the horse to the gatepost. It had carried some of our late father's things that my brother was going to take care of. It was about time for me to go back home, but it was nice to spend some time with my brother. Since the village chief had announced that he wanted everyone in the village to gather up for church next Sunday, I reminded my wife and daughter that we had to go there. After the village chief was done, Lord Sadler held his sermon. Lord Sadler was a person that the village chief respected and revered, and a higher-up in the Los Illuminados religious organization. He had come here especially for the sake of us villagers, and he held a wondrous sermon that lasted for hours. Instead of just trying to purify the sinful blood of heathens like us, he tried to teach us how to cleanse our soul and find the real way to happiness. Heathen. I wonder if he was one as well. My friend, who invited us over for dinner, that is. Shortly after that, his personality had taken a complete turnaround from calm to violent. It was frightening. If one does not attend the sermons, they can't find the way to happiness. The religious organization, Los Illuminados, was there to protect us and save us from ourselves. In order to purify our sinful blood, our hearts had to become like one. We had to put an end to our unclean bloodline. All the villagers lined up to receive the sacred blood. This time, it was my brother's turn. Suddenly, he looked at me and screamed, "Brother, help me!" He was refusing to take part in the ceremony. In order for us villagers to become one, it was imperative that no one refused. Everyone present consulted the kind village chief and Lord Sadler on what to do about it. After having talked to my brother's family, and they too having accepted the ceremony, my brother accepted it before long. On this day, we villagers came to know the truth. The first lord of the castle had become jealous of the Los Illuminados and gotten to be in the way of their good deeds. And Lord Ramon had, in order to restore relations with the religious organization, contributed greatly to their cause, which meant that the tale passed down through generations had been nothing but one big fake. Interesting. The first passage is more standard world building, riding the momentum of the joyous festival. More significantly, Rodrigo takes his wife and daughter to the church. Sadler captivates the villagers with his sermon, allegedly teaching them how to cleanse their sinful blood. Here, he is described as the highly esteemed figure of the Los Illuminados. Rodrigo's friend apparently avoids the sermon and turns violent. Perhaps his friend suspects Los Illuminados of being the same pagan group that once threatened the village and is outraged at the prospect of its revival. The villagers and Rodrigo line up to receive the injection of Las Plagas, which Sadler slyly claims to be the sacred blood. And after having banished Los Illuminados for many generations, the villagers are manipulated into believing that this was a mistake. They now trusted that Los Illuminados intended to cleanse the people of their own filth, saving them from themselves. So, initially, the villagers were critical of Ramon, but they seemed to trust the village chief Torres Mendez and the alleged altruist Osmond Sadler. By abusing their positions of power, these two flipped the script, aggrandizing Ramon Salazar. From this point forth, the villagers would venerate Ramon as the one truly just and righteous lord. How unfortunate for them. Let's see how this plays out. I wonder if the hindrance was out of their way now. My wife coughed and let the concern show on her face. Shortly after having dinner, my daughter suddenly started foaming from her mouth. Her face was warped with terrible pain, and her limbs were shaking furiously. I have to help her. Oh my goodness, what should I do? My daughter, my precious daughter, is dead. I looked at my wife. She just stood there with an expressionless look on her face. I just can't believe what just happened. I refused to believe it. My head started hurting as if it was about to split in two. It felt as if all the blood in my body was boiling, like a terribly painful fever. The next moment, I suddenly heard my daughter's voice in my head, and my entire body started shaking. The voice said, "You worthless piece of shit." I ran over to my brother's house as fast as I could. Something was wrong with his son. He was sick in bed, and around his mouth were traces of him coughing up blood. I asked him, and he said his entire body was in pain. His eyes glared at me, stained with madness, and I covered my ears trying to shut his words of pain out. Over the next few days, all the children in the village had died. Our precious children were all gone, not a single one left. Not a single one. The number of adults who were going mad or had lost all sign of emotion was growing fast. Some would go around doing strange things, some refused to eat, and others would go around muttering as if they were speaking ill of someone, leave for a long while, and then come back. This morning, I also coughed up blood. We have received a message from the village chief. Lord Sadler's life may be in danger. If someone starts snooping around here, kill them. Kill any intruders on sight. The head of one of the men in front of me split in two. For our great Lord Sadler, please bless us with your next order. The village is now an embodiment of fear, with people who lost their way, scheming people, people who seek conflict. From serenity to chaos. This speaks for itself, really. This is how Sadler's gift decimated the very pride and joy of the village, the children, and thus, this is why the village is inhabited solely by adults, enslaved by the ungodly gift Sadler had offered them. This is essentially a larger, darker reimagining of the Keeper's Diary, illustrating the loss of vitality for the villagers, their children, and their kindred souls. With its ending, Resident Evil 4, Incubate, drops us in a pit of despondency, shattering our hopes for the peaceful village that once was. This is a mercilessly effective story. It masterfully portrays the ideal atmosphere for folk horror to thrive, incorporating real pagan-inspired practices and values. It establishes an esoteric, yet truly loving society with no malintent. At their core, most societies of folk horror films are the same way, only displaying their hostility towards the foreign protagonist, usually to manipulate or sacrifice him, as these films often demonize the pagan practices they draw from to elevate the horror. But in Resident Evil 4, the villagers are depicted as pure and innocent, and the bioweapon is the corrupting factor here. This is a perfect way to fuse Resident Evil's viruses with the cult themes of folk horror. And then we have the unchallengeable religious tyrants that opt to abuse their power. This is another traditional folk horror theme. As seen in The Wicker Man, Lord Summerisle is a descendant of a royal bloodline that revitalized pagan traditions, much like Ramon Salazar reintroduced Los Illuminados' paganism to the village, with the help of Sadler.
My grandfather bought this barren island, began to change things. The best way of accomplishing this, so it seemed to him, was to rouse the people from their apathy by giving them back their joyous old gods.
And like Salazar and Sadler, Lord Summerisle plays God as the founder and ruler of his society. Here, people obey him through genuine human veneration and respect. But in Resident Evil 4, the villagers are enslaved by Las Plagas, biologically coerced to serve Sadler. And what's more is that the villagers are the real victims of this story, just as zombies are the true victims of the earlier titles, both falling to the essential evil that defines Resident Evil.
Reports of the death toll surpassing the 100,000 mark. Our hearts go out to those poor civilians of Raccoon City.
This emotional subversion is something that Resident Evil has always entertained, as seen in Steve's confrontation with his infected father, Marvin's transformation moments after meeting Leon, Lisa Trevor's horrid fate, and in many of the S.D. Perry novels. And as we just learned from RE4's prequel story, the villagers are no different. They, too, are victims all the same, and thus doomed to serve their master, embodying a folk horror society when faced by Leon. Brilliant. As we've seen tonight, RE4's storytelling, especially with its prequel novel, is much more layered than it appears to be. So, what was your favorite part of this prequel story? How does this book change your perception of Resident Evil 4? Let us know what you think in the comments, and let us know what type of lore content you'd like to see in the future. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this in-depth analysis video, feel free to check out my personal channel. The link is in the description. Be sure to check out our other novel analyses. These videos explore 2 secret stories within the true story behind Biohazard, and this one examines the potential film inspirations behind House Beneviento of RE Village. More analysis content will be coming to the Residents of Evil sometime soon. Until then, subscribe, or I'll be sure to schedule your appointment with the Wicker Man.